Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right. Hi, welcome to Microsoft Research's Colloquium. We are happy today to have Anima Anand Kumar from UC Irvine, who has been with us for a while and will be with us for a while, and a fellow, and all around great pleasure. So,
thanks a lot, Nancy, and it's a pleasure to be giving the colloquium. I should say that Microsoft Research is like a second home to me. Like I've been here, I was a visiting researcher in 2012. I was here last summer for some time, and been working extensively with Shyam Kakade here, and and also Daniel Shu, who was a postdoc, and with Rong, and with so many here. So it's a great pleasure to be giving this colloquium. So I was told to make this talk fairly, broad. So at least for most of the talk, I'll try to make it, have it accessible to audience across different disciplines. So at any time, feel free to interrupt me if something is not clear. But towards the end, I'll cover a little bit more technical material. So this talk is about learning latent variable models. So what's a latent variable model? So what we have is, when we look at some observed data, we'd like to ask, there are some hidden or latent effects. How do we learn them efficiently? So in particular, today I'll be focusing on this class of what I call overlapping community models. So these are models which posit in graphs or networks. There are some underlying hidden groups or communities of nodes, and how do we discover these communities efficiently? And towards the end, I'll also cover a little bit more on these overcomplete representations. So, today, I'm sure everybody has heard the buzz around big data. We have unprecedented amounts of data in a variety of different domains. We have, social network data, which has been collected now on a huge scale. You can, now explore social interactions, to such a minute detail, which was unimaginable for a while. Yeah.
What's the difference between big data and machine learning or things that we did before?
Yeah, so that that is left to interpretation. So for me, I guess big data is large-scale data, having access to large amounts of data.
Particularly social networks, right?
So, that's what I started with, like the notion that there are many kinds of data available, and usually large scale, but maybe also, it's not just the scale, but also the kinds of data available, right? So let's think of big data as just encompassing kind of all different kinds of information we have today. And this is unprecedented compared to what was there even 10 years ago. Okay, so we have the data from social networks. We have large amounts of text data. You can look up like on Google Books. You have like kind of entire range of books available. You have huge databases of images of all different domain specific or even more unstructured across different domains. We also have now increasing amounts of biological data. This could be like gene expression data, data from like the human brain or different tissues, and so we have data in a variety of different domains. So now the question is, in all these domains, we also would like to reason or learn something from the data, right? So there are hidden effects or information we'd like to mine from the data. So we'd first look at what I'll look at just the graph data to begin with, and then I'll give some intuitions on how our the approaches we have also extend to other kinds of data, such as text data, images, and computational biology as well. So when it comes to graph, so we have a network, and we have various relationship between the nodes in the network. The question is, what kinds of information can we get by observing a network? So you can think of this as a social network of how people interact with one another. This could even be a biological network of how different genes are related to one another and so on. So we have a network and we have these relationships we observe in the network. So what can we reason from such information? Right? So the very first order thing to do is to mine various kinds of statistics from the graph. So it could be like, what are the average degree of different nodes, centrality measures, like how many triangles are present. So various kinds of, simple information you can mine by just once you have the graph at hand. But we can ask about, more nuanced information from the graph. Can we now, look at clustering or grouping nodes into different classes? For instance, if I gave you a graph of this form here, you can see that, that there is this one group of nodes which is very tightly connected with very few edges, into different groups. So you can call them as clusters or groups. So I'll call this, entire set of nodes as one group, and this the other, and so on. So, I can now ask about how we can find, these memberships or groupings of nodes given the graph, right? And another task that is very important in several applications is the notion of predicting missing links. So in many applications, you do not have the entire graph at hand. You may just have some part of the observation. There are some, unknown or hidden links you'd like to learn about. So how do we, utilize efficient approaches for learning about prediction? And we'd like to accomplish all these various tasks on mining information from large graphs. So, think of graphs, with maybe millions or even up to 1 billion nodes. How do we do this efficiently? How do we do this, in a very fast manner, as well as a principled approach that can, provide some guarantees, right? So that's what the talk will be about. So an important task for graph mining, as I said, was to discover these unknown communities or groups. So this, is very intuitive that what the communities mean in various different domains. So if you think of social networks, and so we are all like, you're attending my talk. I mean, there could be various different reasons, right? Either you're interested in machine learning, you're interested in maybe, social networks and sociology, maybe, computational biology. So, there are various different, groups that you can think of people belonging to, and how they interact with one another is driven by these memberships. So that's very relevant to think of communities and social networks. And you can think of the same even in biological networks. There is good evidence of how genes are regulated in groups, what is known as combinatorial regulation, as Tony here gave me much more information about. We were working on a project on computational biology. So genes are regulated in groups. So again, you can now think of these as communities for the genes, right? How I can group genes into different communities. I could even think of the neurons in the brain. They are made up of different kinds of cell types. How I can again group them into these communities. So another popular application is are these recommender systems. So we have information on how users rate various different products. For example, on Yelp, users go and rate various different restaurants or other businesses. So now, how can we think about groups of businesses or groups of users, right? Users may have various different interests, or they may be in particular locations, and you can think of them as the community memberships for the users. Similarly, on the product side, the product may have various different attributes that leads the users to rate them. Yeah.
When you say hidden communities, are you saying hidden from you when you first look, or hidden from the participants?
So hidden from the user, from the observer. So I have access only to these interactions, but there are these unknown interactions that we posit are driving, the whole graph process. So that's what we'd like to learn.
So by and large, it's things that the people may be aware of, so you're having to discover it from the data.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it ever things that they aren't even aware of, but that you think
that's a good question, and maybe you have a better intuition on how humans behave, right? I mean, many times it is conscious, the reason you're attending the talk is, there is an interest. But maybe there's also at a subconscious level how people interact, maybe driven by their innate beliefs or, something that they may not completely be aware of. So it's, so we're not trying to uncover which of the two effects it is, but there are some unknown latent effects that lead people to interact with one another.
In the model related to your discussion, it might be that you aren't connected to someone, so that the model suggests you should be connected to them.
Right. And that's what, you can think of the link prediction task. So now, looking at kind of learning the entire statistical model from data, are there some additional edges that I think should be there but are not there? So this then, will allow us to recommend new products or new businesses to users, right? They may not have rated all the movies or all the restaurants, but look, you can go back and tell the user these are now additional, new businesses you should look into. Okay, so in all these applications, it's very easy to get access to the graph data. So we can, look at who's friends with whom on Facebook or who co-authored with whom, or, looking at recommendations, like which users recommended which products. But it's, typically much harder to learn about the hidden communities. So in many cases, it may be even at a subconscious level, right? So, and even otherwise, it's much more expensive to get this information. So that's the task here, how we can learn about these hidden communities. Okay, so let's think about what the communities mean and some very simple, models of how people in different communities may interact with one another. One of the simplest models you can think of is so-called what I'll call a pure membership model. So every node just belongs to a single community. So think of this as the adjacency matrix. So here, there are a set of nodes here, and I'm asking how they're connected to the other set of nodes here, right? So these rows and columns correspond to the nodes in the network, and these are the edges. And so the red, blue, and green means there are 3 different communities, and users belong to just one of them. And we want to ask how nodes in different communities talk to one another, right? What are the edges? So what we in this simple model, we are saying that there are more edges within the same community than outside, right? So this is a simple block model. Just by looking at the blocks, you can see, oh, this should be one group of nodes, right? This should be another group, and so on. So this is one of the simplest model possible for how there are communities in networks, right? But now we can think of adding a bit more complications. Instead of thinking of a node being in a single community or a single group, a node now may have membership into multiple different communities. So here I'm representing that by now these different colors. So earlier it was just pure blue, green, and red, but now there's a mix of different colors that show how different nodes have a range of different memberships, right? Sure, at this extreme here, there are still nodes with just membership into this blue community, almost into just one community. And you can see that they're more densely connected here, but on the other hand, there are nodes here that now are in multiple communities, right? So you can think of, say, for instance, I'm interested primarily in machine learning, but I also have interests in signal processing, information theory, and some other areas, right? So, and algorithms. So you can think of now a weighted membership of a node into multiple different groups. So if I now posit such a model, the observed graph is indeed much more messy to look at. Even to visualize, we know, it's harder to tell what the communities are. So, and as we increase the amount of overlap, so here I've made a graph where the nodes have even more amount of mixture across into different groups. So the communities overlap to a larger extent. So in that case, we have, it's even harder to tell what the communities are. Right? So this visualization is just to drive home the point that the notion of community itself may be not so clear if you look at a large, complicated graph. Right? There's this very simple model that says, communities, you can think of them as tightly connected groups of, tightly connected groups of nodes, and and you put every node in just one group. But as soon as you relax the constraint to have a node in multiple groups, it's trickier to ask what a community is and how to find communities from graphs efficiently. Okay, so that's the question we'd like to address. So indeed, like area of community detection is a very vast area, from theoretical, computer science to more, in sociology, in a variety of different areas. So indeed, I won't be covering all the works, but I just want to give some intuitions on how the, existing approaches try to group nodes into different communities. So if, most of the works think of a network as being like, these nodes have tight connections within the group and maybe only sparse connections across different groups, right? So one of the popular notions is to look for sparse cuts in the graph. I mean, indeed, like spectral clustering is a relaxation of that. So the idea is that the number of edges that go across different groups should be minimized. So that's one criterion you can think of for looking for communities, right? So another class of methods also look for the notion of homophily. So this is the notion that birds of the same feather flock together. So we have nodes within the same community. They have to be much more highly connected compared to people outside, right? So you can utilize various different notions to think of looking for communities. But indeed, there are some shortcomings of thinking of these notions. So if you think about, these, like notion of cuts, it's not easy to deal with overlapping communities, right? Because when communities overlap, you may not have this clear separation, as in the case of, these non-overlapping clusters. And in many settings, homophily may not even be the right assumption to look at. Because if you think of the recommender system, there are users rating movies or products. It's a bipartite graph, and now you want to ask how, whether, like you want to think of groups of users based on how similarly they connect to different products, right? So it has to be something beyond just homophily.
I'm puzzled as to why you think of sparse cuts and homophily as two somehow different approaches. I mean, I would have thought you need to put both.
Sure,
One is an assumption on how your algorithm works. The other is an assumption on what the model.
Sure. So what I meant was I wanted to. I'm saying they're not necessarily separate, or they're two notions. More, the methods could take them into account together or separately. I mean, there are some methods which only think of homophily. Okay, I just want to look for connectivity and try to find strong connectivity in a group, right? So they are indeed related. I'm not saying they're separate. Okay, but the message is that these notions may not be easily extendable to cases when I want to allow for overlaps between communities. Okay, so let's see what our approach is as an alternative to these notions. So so what we'd like to think of is having graphs and mining different subgraphs from it. And we'd like to ask from, looking at the counts of these subgraphs, what can I tell about the communities? So think of this as, if I want to look at it as a statistical model, I have a random graph distribution, and I want to compute moments of this distribution. And from the moments, can I mine the communities? So this fundamentally differs from the other approaches because this, posits a probabilistic model on how, nodes are in different communities and how different communities connect with one another. So let's think of some simple, subgraphs. So what I'll call a star graph. A star graph is, having a head and like these leaves. And we'll look for such structures in my observed network. So if I wanted this, where like one of the simplest object is what I call this two stars, right? So I have a star with two leaves, and I want to count this across different partitions. So I'm going to partition my graph into roughly 3 equal parts. So think of this as I want to ask how many nodes are present such that they connect to a common neighbor across the cut, right? So here I'm asking for a fixed node A and B, how many common neighbors are present across the cut. And I'm going to do this for every pair of nodes, and I'm going to collect them together as a matrix. So this information is telling me how do every pair of nodes have how many common neighbors they have across some cut. Right, so this is an intuitive information to have because you're now not only looking at who is friends with whom, but who are like common friends of mine. And this is very popular heuristic in many sociological analysis because you want to look for common friends. And that's what we are doing. And here, by the way, just to clarify, there may be additional edges between these sets here, but we are only looking for the common neighbors.
X is some fixed set.
X is some fixed set. Right, all these are fixed sets. So I'm just going to partition my graph into these 3 parts and then look for just the edges across the cut. And this partitioning removes some of the dependencies that we posit will occur in a statistical model. So this is more, to show certain guarantees exist. So, but the basic idea is clear, right? So we are looking for these common connectivity in the form of these 2 stars. So you can, so this, by doing this for every pair of nodes, we got a matrix. You can do the same with triplets of nodes, and then we obtain a tensor. So you can think of tensor just, naively as a 3-dimensional array. Sure, it has other interpretations, but for now, just think of it as a 3-dimensional array. So for every triplet of nodes here, so I'm now, partitioning my set of nodes into 4 sets here. And for every triplet here, I'm looking for common neighbors across the set. So now I'm looking for these, for every triplet of nodes, who are the common neighbors, right? So this, you can think of it as a 3rd-order information, right? So a pair of nodes only gave you like kind of these pairwise relationships, but now I'm getting a higher-order relationship. So indeed, this tensor is intuitively more informative than the matrix. Right? The matrix just was of size n square, where n is the size of the network. But now, well, there's also C here. This tensor, which looks at counting the as what I call 3 stars for every triplet, right? So the size is n cubed. So we have a lot more information. So the question is then, how does this help us? Right? So this is where we'll show that when we have overlapping communities, this can lead to efficient recovery. Whereas just with a matrix, there is not enough information to recover such information efficiently. Okay, so this is the statistic that I'll work with. Yeah, so once we have these counts, right, counts of either 2 stars or 3 stars, what more can we do with them? So one of the very simplest things you can do if you have a matrix is to find a decomposition, right, like the singular value decomposition. So it's a compact, representation of the matrix, right? And we can think of doing the same even with tensor. So think of this as the higher order analog of singular value decomposition. So I have this tensor which looks at the counts of these 3 stars for, across all triplets of nodes, and I want to find a compact decomposition of it, right? So think of this as a representation of my tensor in a compact manner. And I'll get into the details of how we go about doing this. So if we end up doing this, we'll be able to recover the communities. So that's the very high-level picture of what, how this approach goes about doing. So just to recap what the overall approach is, we divide the graph into 4 equal parts, and for every triplet here, I'm going to count the number of common neighbors across the cut. And I'm going to then decompose this tensor. I'm going to find a compact representation, and using that information, I can learn the communities. Right? So this is a very high-level idea of how the approach works.
Does it depend on the partition that you do?
So the partitioning depends on which of the communities you can mine. So you will mine the communities of some subset of nodes here, and you can just reverse it.
So every partition you get a different matrix?
Right. So this depends on the partition, right? Because you only look at these triplets across the partition.
So you have, how do you choose the partition? Okay.
So randomly. In practice, you can do more careful choice by making sure there are enough edges across the cut. Right. So, but in theory, you could just do it randomly. Yeah. So that's the high-level approach.
So in general, it's going to tell you very little about how similar are two different elements in A to each other, right, in capital A.
Yeah.
Because here typically looks like, or can it actually?
So it can, because what it's saying is, I have like kind of the information of, so I just showed it for, one node here, but I have the entire set of edges from this node going to the set, right? So I have the information for each of these sets. And I'll, come to the details of how exactly we go about doing it. But let's first see what this can.
Basically, the friends of your friends are your friends.
So it does.
Yeah. So, I mean, so you get all the edge information across the cut. Right. So let's first look at some experiments on real-world data and what we are able to mine. So these are just some, so I wanted to show this to, kind of drive home the point that this is a very fast and efficient approach for mining communities. And the competitive approach that I compared against was this variational inference approach, which again learns the same class of probabilistic models, which I'll come to it in a minute, but is much slower because it looks at maximizing the likelihood of this model that we posit. And so I looked at this Facebook network. This is a pretty small network with just 20,000 nodes, all the way up to this DBLP, which is the co-authorship network with about 1 million nodes here. And so you can see this was just on a single workstation. We could just run this DBLP network in roughly 1.5 hours. So this is a very fast method for recovering the communities. Right, so this is just to show that this works well across different benchmark data sets. So let me give you some qualitative idea of what we can learn from this method. So we recovered, so what we did was in Yelp data, you have users reviewing various different businesses. And so there's the ground truth of what the business is about, right? So you have the categories, but we held them apart. We didn't give the categories to the method. So the method automatically recovered what the categories were, and then we matched them to these ground truth categories. And then we asked what were the categories that were recovered with highest accuracy. So to give us an intuition on how we can efficiently mine communities in networks. Right, so perhaps not so surprisingly, the top category was this Latin American restaurant. I mean, on Yelp, anybody thinking of Yelp, always thinks of restaurants, right? So restaurants are like a very big community here. And this was in Arizona, so Latin American being the a very large community, and hence it has been recovered accurately is perhaps not so surprising. But what's more surprising is we are able to recover even smaller communities such as hobby shops or mass media. I mean, you don't even think of them as existing in Yelp, but our method was able to recover them accurately. And the intuition here is, if you think of like who would go and rate hobby shops, it's usually like very strong enthusiast for hobby shops, right? So they would usually go and just rate hobby shops and not rate any other business. So this method is able to mine that information because we are looking at common connectivity pattern. So we're looking at what groups of users go and rate this business, together, right? So that's why it's able to mine even small communities because of this connectivity pattern. And another useful information we can recover from our setting is multiple attributes or multiple communities to users. So in the usual setting, usually a node is given to a single community, but now we are able to recover multiple different attributes. For instance, business can be a restaurant, a bar, what kind of food it serves, it could have nightlife, what location it is. So think of this framework as being able to mine a variety of different attributes for a business here. Right? So this is useful for me to know like how users perceive businesses in a variety of different ways. Yeah.
So for your Yelp example, what information goes into it? Like I reviewed these 5 places.
Exactly, that's it. I mean, we use the just the rating. We use the rating, but not the text. So you could do a lot more with text, but this was just the bipartite graph information with weights.
Okay, so the input knows that I liked this place and I didn't like that place.
Yeah.
Okay, but the category of places leaps out more than just like good and bad places?
So right now we've just looked at like this is the largest weight business. So think of this as a very popular restaurant, right? So this has the highest rating within this category. So I only talked about recovering the categories, but we can also recover who are the popular businesses in that category from this information.
And just so I'm clear, I feel like I lost track of how you were defining community. That's the group of users who have come together to rate a certain business.
Yeah. So, and that's what the tensor is. It's looking at triplet of users, and it's asking how they rate different groups of businesses together. So I'm taking all the users, all the businesses, and finding this
It's not
three-dimensional
like
tensor.
It's like the groups of communities that tend to rate a particular type of business.
So it's in the entire group. So the entire group of users, entire group of businesses, and I'm asking, how they rate together as like a three-dimensional array. Like every triplet of users, how they rate all the businesses, right? So I get this three-dimensional array. And I'm manipulating that and then recovering the community.
I just imagine a very different definition of community. That would be almost the opposite, but I'll let that go. Yeah,
but what was your... Yeah, so here I'm thinking of communities of businesses as being similarly rated by users, right? How our users are rating them.
Yes.
Right? But here, because we have the ground truth on what the communities mean, we are able to give an interpretation.
Do you have similarity in ratings, or is it actually...
and also who rated whom, not just,
it's not just similar in ratings, it's like, okay.
Right? I mean, first they have to rate the business. Like that's the intuition, like hobby shops is not rated by everybody. So it's only rated by a small group of users, so you can tell that apart as a different community.
You're also using one side, which is which group of businesses get rated together.
Sorry?
You're also using the fact that groups of businesses get rated together by the same group of
exactly.
people. So
Exactly.
It's not just a rating.
No, not just one business at a time. It's the entire information together. So that's the kind of power of this method. We are trying to look at like the common structure across from users to businesses.
Wait, so if I understand correctly, three groups are then just ratings, people, and businesses, then?
Yeah. So this is clear? So now let me give a little more information about the algorithmic approach, so how we go about doing this. Right? So as I said, we have this now three-dimensional tensor that looks at, for every triplet of users, how many edges I have across the cut. And what we want to aim to do is to look at a low-rank representation of it. So we want to decompose this tensor into components where the number of components is equal to the number of communities. And I'll come to it in a minute on when this has guarantees, when this is actually a good idea. But the first question I want to ask is, given a tensor which I'm guaranteed to have approximately just a compact representation, that is representation in terms of just k terms where each term is a rank 1 tensor. So the notion of a rank 1 tensor is very similar to a rank 1 matrix where the every entry of rank 1 tensor is just indexed by the corresponding entries of the vectors, right, forming the tensor. So I have, I want to find this low rank representation of the tensor. How do I go about doing this? So one intuition on why we want to look at a low rank representation is that even though this is a huge tensor, the size of this tensor is n cubed, where n is the number of nodes, but the edges are only driven by the community memberships, right? So think of it as like all the information is only in terms of like this k terms, where k is the number of communities, and that's what we want to mine for. So the main idea of how to go about doing this efficiently is not to find this decomposition directly, but to find a reduced dimension tensor and do the decomposition on that tensor. So what we are going to do is just convert this huge tensor to a smaller tensor of size k cubed, where k is the number of communities. And then we'll find the decomposition of the smaller tensor. I mean, this is very typical in many of the even matrix methods, right? You want to reduce the size of the matrix and then do efficient computation. But in the tensor case, in this we can even enforce some additional structure while doing dimensionality reduction, which is a strength of having tensors versus matrices. You can get learn a lot more and impose a lot more structure. So the main intuition is if I have this tensor of size n cubed, I can find certain transformations. So these are, so this, I'll call this as the first mode of the tensor, the second mode, and third mode. And so along each of the modes of the tensor, I can find transformations given the data that whiten the modes. Meaning like, so think of like, I'll look at all the vectors u1 through uk, and they may not be orthogonal. But now I can find a transformation that returns an orthogonal system. And this I can do it because I have additional information. I have data available from which I can compute, like say, for instance, pairwise moments and find such a transformation. So the upshot of this is, given this large tensor, I'm indeed reducing it to a smaller tensor, but then this tensor now also will have a orthogonal structure. So the components of this tensor are now orthogonal, whereas the original tensor did not have that constraint. I mean, we do need like some simple assumptions of non-degeneracy that these components have full column rank. So in this case, you can always find these transformations, and because we have access to data, you can in fact compute it from data. So that's the interesting part, that the tensors may not always have an compact orthogonal decomposition, but because of this transformation, I can convert it to an orthogonal form. So in many ways, it differs from matrices, but we can also exploit them in interesting ways. So, and once we have an orthogonal tensor, finding the decomposition is much more simple. It's now analogous to finding singular value decomposition for matrices. So you can think of like running like power methods. So the idea is all the components of the orthogonal tensor are eigenvectors. So I can initialize the eigenvector using some random initialization, run this for, usually in practice this converges very fast, and then I can do this, for enough number of times to recover all the components. So this is the, kind of the high-level algorithmic approach on how to decompose a tensor. So what I said so far was that if the tensor indeed has nearly a rank K representation, by doing this first dimensionality reduction and then running these tensor power iterations, I can recover them with guarantees. I can correctly recover that decomposition. And indeed, like in our works, we have like careful perturbation analysis on how this performs with noise. Right? So this is the overall approach. Now the question is, can we provide actually guarantees? So what I suggested is so far a heuristic, right? So I said, look at triplets of nodes, look at how they connect to common neighbors, find a compact representation of this, and I told you a method to do this efficiently. And the method said that if indeed such a compact representation exists, it will correctly recover it. So then the next question is, what are reasonable assumptions under which looking at the connectivity of these three stars has such a compact representation? And that's where we'll impose statistical constraints. So we'll come up with now some hypothesis on how nodes in different communities indeed connect with one another. And then show that under those constraints, this three-star tensor indeed has a low rank representation. And that's why we can recover them with guarantees. Okay? So I'll just give you a brief intuition of what this model says. So now I have a model, right? I'm hypothesizing how, there are some unknown communities of users. So think of it here as interests of different users. So somebody is interested in dancing, computers, and so on. And there's some unknown weights of how much the users are interested into these different communities, right? Or maybe the amount of time they spend in pursuing these different communities. And now how I form the edges given these communities is to come up with random draws. So I look at I randomly draw a pair of nodes, and then I randomly draw one of the communities from this mixture. So based on these weights, I'm going to draw one of the communities. Right? So say the context in which these two people met was, was dancing, right? So they ended up being at a dance at the same time, so they ended up meeting. So in that case, there's some unknown probability of them actually becoming friends, and that's pretty high. So because they met in a context which they were having common interest. On the other hand, if two people had, were in different contexts when they met, they're, like say computers and hiking, they may not have a very high chance of being friends. So that's what this model is, positing, that people have a variety of different interests, and they meet in kind of, they randomly draw contexts when they meet with one another, and based on the current context of the meeting, they have edges being drawn. So that's the model here. And what are the additional statistical constraints? We posit that all the edges are conditionally independent given the communities. So in some sense, how nodes are present in various communities drives the connectivity pattern of the graph, right? So that's what we'd like to then, given the graph, learn the communities. And so this model indeed was, this model was proposed earlier. This is the model, Airoldi et al. And the nice thing is we can now incorporate mixed memberships or memberships into variety of different communities using this framework. And so one additional thing that's imposed is a particular distribution of how nodes belong to multiple communities. So this so-called Dirichlet distribution, what it does is it encourages sparsity. So think of it as my range of communities as all possible hobbies or interests. So a person is typically interested only a few hobbies, right? So we have only sparse memberships, and again this probabilistic model enforces sparsity. And the nice thing is by tuning the parameters of this model, we can tolerate a variety of different sparsity. So meaning like now how many communities a node belongs to is tuned by this parameter. And so that's the idea of having a probabilistic model for, and this picture I wanted to just show that for a variety of different parameters of this model, I can have a range of different overlaps between communities. Okay? So what this model gives me is now additional constraints on what the 3-star structure should be, right? So recall that we were looking at these 3 stars, which said that for every triplet of nodes here, what is the connectivity pattern? So now under additional conditional independence assumptions of this, the model that I just described, what we obtain is constraints, right? So if I look at a particular node here and look at its entire set of edges to each of these subsets, right, so that I represent by these vectors here, all these 3 neighborhood vectors are conditionally independent given this unknown community membership vector. So we have like an intuition that I'm looking at the common connectivity pattern of these 3 sets of edges, right? But in addition, what I'm doing is assuming that the only commonality that's relating these edges is the membership of this node here. And so using these constraints leads us to come up with the result that indeed, if in expectation, if I looked at these 3-star connectivity patterns, they do have a low rank representation. And the rank of that is just the number of communities. So at a high level, what I did was to impose a probabilistic model under which these 3-star count measurements have a compact representation. And so now, if we want to learn this model, you can learn this representation and we can recover the parameters. So the upshot of this is not only just to learn the communities, we are learning a statistical model that says how, nodes in different communities are, connected with one another. Right, so that is the overall framework here. So just in terms of like the technical results, like what can we guarantee? So, so we have the model of how communities overlap with one another, and our algorithmic approach was to look at how, by mining the low rank representation in these 3-star tensor, we can recover the communities. So then the next question is, what are the requirements, right? Under what conditions can we have efficient recovery? So, just to give some very simple intuitions of what these bounds mean. So I'm asking the size of the network to be at least quadratic in the number of communities, or rather the size of each community to be like of order square root n, where n is the number of nodes. Right? So this is indeed like the planted clique bound. You cannot do below this, at least conjecture to do below this efficiently. So we are tight up to the planted-clique bound. So we can recover communities up to the number of communities being quadratic in the number of nodes. And the other scaling requirement is how sparse or the dense the graphs are. Right? So intuitively, if I have very sparse graphs, I have even less information. Right? So if I have no edges, I have no information on what the communities are. So what this is saying is that the sparsity level that I can tolerate is given by this expression. And what this means is I can tolerate graphs up to just like having polylogarithmic degrees, which is kind of, again, the limit of how sparse the graphs can get and yet be learnable. So we are tight in terms of getting efficient bounds in terms of mining a large number of communities as well as mining very sparse graphs. So which is very relevant in practice as well, because many real world graphs are sparse and may have large number of communities. Right? And the other nice thing is we are also able to characterize how these guarantees degrade as I increase the amount of overlap between the communities. And that's given by this parameter in my model here. So think of this alpha naught as like representing roughly the amount of overlap between different communities. And again, we have only a very graceful degradation of how the requirements change as I have more overlapping communities. So the theoretical bounds are saying, we have efficient, we can correctly recover all the communities even under overlaps as long as I have like, large enough size of network and, enough edges to have this recovered.
So is that condition roughly saying I should have about connections to square root of n members in the population?
So this one here?
Yeah.
So this one is saying like P is the connectivity within a group and Q is outside. And so K is the number of communities. So if it's constant number of communities, right, this is like 1 over square root n.
And that's the probability of a certain edge. So
you can go up to
about square root of n people that I'm connected to.
No, but there's also square root P here. So it's saying, so P can be like up to like polylog by n, which is the limit. So up to polylog factors, this is tight. So we can, have graphs with very low connectivity, and what this, so all these bounds are similar to stochastic block models, right, with no overlap. But in addition, what we are saying is if there is overlap, the degradation is also graceful, and we can say what it is. Okay. So, and by the way, this appeared in Colt last year, and so with Sham, Daniel, and Ronk. And just to give you an idea of what the guarantees mean, because we have like nodes belonging to multiple communities, we have these weighted memberships. So we can give like kind of norm bounds on being able to recover these weights correctly, in relation to the ground truth weights. And we can also convert them to support recovery guarantees by asking what are the significant memberships for every node, and we have zero error recovery for all the nodes in the network with high probability. So, so think of this as being, for most practical, cases, I want to know what are the significant memberships of a node, right? And this says that we have guarantees that can be recovered efficiently. Okay, so that was in terms of the theoretical results, and in practice, to make it scalable to huge networks, there are indeed a lot of algorithmic improvements we've done. We've incorporated like randomized techniques for finding these widening matrices, which was to do dimensionality reduction of the tensor. And of course, most importantly, we are never explicitly forming this tensor. Because this tensor is of size n cubed, where n is the size of nodes and n is 1,000,000, right? And we ran it on a single workstation. So if we had to form the tensor, that would be just not a practical idea. But we can do it implicitly, and we can parallelize. We also have like GPU implementations. So many of these like kind of taking into account many practical considerations makes this very efficient and scalable for large networks. And in fact, like the parallel time complexity is as you have more and more cores, right? It's just linear in the number of nodes in the network. And typically, the size of the number of communities is usually much smaller than the number of nodes. So this is the dominant term. And this says we can parallelize this to essentially a very high amount. Okay, so just to wrap up, I mean, so what I showed was the use of tensor factorization techniques for learning communities, hidden communities in networks. This framework is applicable for a range of other models. Topic models are models that say how, like different words occur in documents, right? And what are the topics that drive these occurrence of words? Like Gaussian mixtures or like classical mixture models. Hidden Markov models can say, like, for instance, in temporal data, I have hidden states that drive my observations. These latent tree or hierarchical models say that there are hierarchy of hidden variables that generate my observed data. So in all these different models, the common unifying framework is that the moments have additional statistical constraints that lead to low rank representations. And we can find these representations efficiently and through them learn the model with guarantees. And so in summary, that's the main idea that these tensor techniques are very efficient, they're scalable to large graphs, and in addition, they have guarantees. So theoretically, we can guarantee we recover the correct underlying communities under very tight bounds, as well as be able to learn a range of other latent variable models. And in practice, we see that it's scalable to large graphs, and it compares very favorably compared to state-of-art like likelihood-based techniques, which try to learn the probabilistic model by aiming to maximize likelihood, which can be very expensive to do and not scalable to large graphs. Okay, so I'll stop here, and I think I have 5 minutes, but I'd rather take questions than cover additional material.
Or is that something you?
So we can again do cross validation in practice. We could compute it. So in the experiments we just fix some k, but in practice you can estimate that as well through cross validation.
Selection criteria then?
Yeah, so like cross validation we can do it through.
So then you must have some concept of goodness of fit.
Right, because we have a probabilistic model here. We have the likelihood, right? So we can ask how I can maximize this likelihood on held out data or data that is, like fresh data.
Okay, so if you compare your estimates to some of the other models that you talked about,
yeah.
How do they compare in terms of likelihood since they're directly maximized?
So I didn't show it here, and right now, in fact, we have experiments that we're working on even on a. So in this case, we had actually the ground truth. So our error measure was to compare how to recover the communities directly. So we didn't look at the likelihood in this set of experiment. But in another set where we looked at text data, we see that we can get even better likelihood than some of the other techniques. Because those techniques can get stuck in local optima, they can be very inefficient to run. So these can in fact be better. Yeah.
So why the choice of 3 tensors?
So third order is the next thing to do after matrices, right? So as you go to higher order tensors, you would need like larger amounts of data for concentration.
Why not 2?
So with 2, the main idea is I just have the subspace, right? I don't know what the exact communities are, and because they're overlapping, there's no separation. I can't do any clustering. So whereas with 3, because it's like a third order tensor, you have a decomposition that need not be orthogonal and still be identifiable.
Information theoretically shouldn't.
Sure, and information theoretically as well, just from parameter counting. We're just at the cusp with 2. That's why like non-negativity constraints could be other ways, settings to with additional constraints, right? So with kind of more, some. There may be other frameworks where you could make that work under some limited, settings. But the third
Statistics are enough here, even with non-negativity constraints.
No, but like say like anchor word or other assumptions, right? So you need additional constraint, not just non-negative. Right. I mean that itself is not always enough, but some additional constraints. So whereas with third order, they're very simple non-degeneracy constraints under which we can recover the representation.
I have a little question, not a bigger question. So my little question is, would it be better with 4, but it would just be way harder, and then even better with 5, and then way better with 6, or at some point?
So what this is saying is, in order to have a 4th order tensor, right? I need like much more data to be able to compute it with some confidence.
So it's a data problem,
right.
not a
right. And for the kind of information we are mining, we are saying 3 suffices. So
yeah.
So with
suffices for what? What would you?
So what I mean is suffices to say like we can guarantee the correct recovery for these kind of community information that I'm looking for. 3 is enough. Okay. So with 4 you could probably mine different kinds of information, right? So that maybe so in practice it may reveal something more, but under this model it says 3 is enough.
Okay. So my other question is about this. Isn't really a fair question because you guys use community the way you use it, and that's fine. It has its meaning within your world. But I'm wondering, because community is, of course, a sociological metaphor.
Right.
And you're not really talking about, like, membership groups that people belong to. You're talking about more like patterns of memberships of data points. Is that a fair?
So,
can you talk?
I mean, so I did give like a hypothesis, right? Well, how I think of people interact with one another. So the hypothesis was each person belongs to multiple different communities, and they have certain weights, or the amount of time they spend in these communities, and how they interact depends on kind of a probabilistic model of choosing what the communities are and when they are interacting.
Talk, it seemed like an individual may or may not ascribe very much value to belonging to the group that you're associating.
Right, right. So right now, I mean, we kind of may have a very general flexible framework. I mean, this is not necessarily saying that, the person, with a membership would always interact with a person with another membership. But this allows for the whole range of models, right?
Yeah,
So
I guess what I'm kind of wondering anyway is why you think why that's the metaphor that got adopted rather than like group or cluster or set or...
So, I mean, these are indeed groups, but we are saying these clusters could now overlap, Now, person may not just have this, huge one interest and connect only based on that one interest, right?
Right.
Now,
I understand. I guess I'm just wondering why the word community? Why not a word like... I mean, because clusters you could say there's clusters and the clusters overlap, right?
Right.
So
I guess for you, community may mean something.
Mean something really different. So I'm just kind of, it's an extreme.
So what do you mean?
I'm not saying it's bad that you use it. I just want to be clear on that. I'm trying to understand why.
I mean, sociological explanation that I see it is why people form ties, right? Is driven by the communities they belong to, and this particular model is saying, based on how people belong to.
Because you're saying it as data traces of people's activities, you're mapping that onto, you're imputing some kind of communal membership of human beings in the lived world. And
this is the only aspect of community that you could infer from
data, right?
I mean, there can be a definition of community which no one knows, and it has because it has no impact on your behavior. So if there is going to be a definition of community based on behavior, this is the kind of definition we come up with.
So maybe somewhat in between, I think the right question is, are these too crude? So in a sense, like in the Yelp one, it isn't sort of associating with the community. It's, there's this group of people that tend to like this restaurant. Right. Do they like similar restaurants? And that really is a statistical...
It's mapping flows of people in space.
It's kind of like looking for connectivity patterns, right? Like kind of correlated connectivity patterns. That's what it's doing.
Good, like, in terms of like restaurant suggestions, things like that, it might actually be, they might actually ascribe to it in that they find good suggestions, but sort of maybe the flip side to your question is just that are there more refined notions that one can estimate? And this is pretty...
I guess when I think about community, I think about if you said to me as a Yelp user, Nancy, what communities do you belong to? The last thing I would say is people who like to eat at and name the 4 restaurants I like.
So it depends on what network you look at, right? So in some sense, the communities we can mine for...
Okay,
Right.
well, there you're capturing something about
Right.
social.
So what I mean is the communities we can mine is dependent on the data, right? So if it's like friendship ties, it would be like what drives friendships. If it's co-authorship, so it depends on so it's like in the context of certain kinds of data.
A nice experiment out here where we can look at papers written by sociologists, what they call communities and what they don't.
That's a good way.
You know, some
Sociologists
communities from
have,
the
I mean,
papers.
because everybody, including myself, who's ever written about community online from a social perspective, we always start with it's like the Alaskans having 2,000 words for snow, right? We always start with our sociologists have 300 definitions of community.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's a very contested term, right?
The notion community have been used in all possible
in a
ways.
way, I'm just sort of asking to better understand the way that you're using it and sort of why that's the word that your community of scholars has chosen to represent what a bunch of data points coming together.
So it's like, we have a graph to begin with, right? So it's like so kind of the intuition is what drives the connectivity in this graph.
Right.
So
but
the
if
hidden.
you're doing the same thing to neurons or to cells, then that's something different from when you're talking about
But again,
people in a neighborhood who tend to frequent particular kinds of restaurants.
but again, there may be like kind of similar processes because again, like Tony will probably say that better, but there are like different cell types of neurons, and like there are like hypotheses of like how common cell types will have similar connectivity patterns. So in many ways, the notion of community may kind of extend to various different settings and not just human beings.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you so much. Step outside, so please feel free to continue the conversation.